Ready? Professor Sigrist. The beard's getting a little thicker, a little white showing up here, showing my age a bit. I want to give a lecture now on Marx on religion with their previous thinkers, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, to some degree, maybe not as much on Kant, but some degree. We talked about um, their treatment of religion. And part of the reason that I've stressed this is that you can see the modern project to some degree as various efforts to replace Christianity with something else. Right. We talked about how liberalism is, in effect, can be seen as a secularized Christianity, right? Um, how the basic values of liberalism are reinterpreted Christian values. Um, and I've suggested also, began to suggest with Kant, that the Christian conception of history as going somewhere, right? Um, and as having an end that involves a transformation of the world and a transformation of mankind that comes out of Christianity is a factor in these various modern political theories, a critical factor. Um, and each of our thinkers before had tried to um, solve or resolve the problem of religion in society, the problem of religious conflict, the problem of the role of religion in society, and so forth. And Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau each had their own answers to that question. Um, but none of them went as far as Marx to say that it's absolutely critical that everybody recognizes that religion is simply false, that there is no God. And the recognition that there is no God is absolutely critical to um, getting on with what we need to get on with. And developing that theme, um, perhaps it'd be beneficial to start with Marx's famous line that religion is the opium of the masses. You may have heard of that. The idea is that religion is an artificial narcotic numbing people to the pains of life, right? Um, and that while this has a perhaps comforting effect, it prevents them from getting on with life and dealing with their problems, actually solving their problems, right? Um, it's very akin to the expression you've heard that religion is a crutch for the weak, right? Who can't deal with their own problems. This is part of what he has in mind. So, what is Marx's theory of religion? I'll start with his analysis of religion. The starting point um, for Marx is his materialist assumption, right? That everything, including people's ideas about reality, their ultimate ideas about God and you know the way society should be, etc., all is determined by material and, in particular, economic relations. Right? It's materialist determinism. Right? Um, and the conception of man and society that comes out of this, Marx talked about in terms of what he called structure and superstructure. So there's a structure of things, which is what's really going on, the material economic relations uh, that, that that we are part of, right? That's reality. Then on top of this structure is a superstructure of ideas that unless they involve a coming to terms with those real material conditions on the ground, are simply false. What they come out of is economic relations. In particular, they reflect the views of the dominant ruling class, right? Um, the religion that they develop uh, helps to secure their control over society, right? They may believe it. They may really believe it, but it's really serves a political and economic function of uh, justifying their position in society, right? Um, and since man is what Marx calls a species being, that is, we're fundamentally linked with other people, and in an important sense, constituted by our relations with other people. Because of this, the individual must be understood as uh, being formed by, shaped by the superstructure, whatever the superstructure is. So, I am the product of the material conditions of society, but the way I think is determined uh, partly by the the ideas that emerge from this. So, if I grow up in a bourgeois, liberal society, a liberal capitalist society, if I grow up in a society like that, I tend to have liberal capitalist ideas, right? Um, I am a product of this false consciousness um, of the superstructure, right? But Marx is the first to use the term ideology in a pejorative sense to mean people who have concocted ideas and therefore have a false consciousness, a false view of things, right? So ideology is, in his understanding, is by definition a bad thing, expressing a false consciousness, right? So how does Marx understand the idea of God? I mean, how do people get ideas of God exactly? Um, I've already suggested part of it, but um, ultimately you could say that for Marx, God is a projection of idealized human qualities. So we are what we are because of these material conditions. And then we project our human qualities onto some external object in the sky, so to speak. And so God is sort of an image of us. Um, Unlike the biblical idea that we are created in the image of God, it's the other way around, that we create God in our image, right? Um, so there is no God except for the God of our own making, right? Um, and human empowerment comes fundamentally, a big part of it is recognizing that this is a projection of ourselves and retrieving those qualities that we've given to God as our own, taking ownership of them, and thereby being able to become not dependent on some imaginary being, but controlling our own lives, right? So that, the idea of God as a great creative power, right? Um, who is self-directed and who directs things according to his own will and so forth. These ideas about God we now have about ourselves, and we become self-creators and world creators. This is Marx's idea. Now, what are the philosophical and political implications of this? Well, first of all, as Marx says, and I think it's called the Contributions to a Critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. Philosophy of right is another um, work of Hegel, in addition to the philosophy of history. And in that critique, Marx says that religion must be the first object of critique. Right? Marx has a critical philosophy. His whole approach to philosophy is critiquing the prevailing state of things, right? Whether it's the, the prevailing religion, the prevailing school of thought, the prevailing class structure, superstructure, etc. Structure and superstructure. Um, that the idea is that for Marx, and he says this explicitly, that the critique of religion is foundational to all other critiques. It's the most fundamental critique, and it is an absolutely essential point for the development of the theory. And this ultimately becomes a critique of reality itself, right? A critique of, Marx uses the term, which was first used by Augustine, that this world is a vale of tears, and Marx can't accept that. That is not tolerable to Marx. So we must criticize this vale of tears, and we must overcome it. We must transform the world, right? But the beginning of this is the critique of religion, right? Now this all plays into the conception of history. I think I said before in an earlier lecture that Marx inverts Hegel's view of history, turns it upside down. So Hegel's view was that history is a process of embodiment of what he called the absolute spirit, right? In the material world, right? So that God becomes flesh. It's an incarnation of God in the world, but also for Hegel, a realization that that our spirit is simply a manifestation of the absolute spirit, so that the absolute spirit is really our spirit. But all that's not critical for our purposes here. The general purpose is that history is a process of embodiment of the absolute spirit for Hegel. And Marx says, no, it's exactly the other way around. This dialectic that Hegel presents, we've talked about it before, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The dialectic here that involves, a clash of ideas, and things are really driven by ideas, which are driven by this movement of spirit. That has it backwards. It shouldn't. The Hegel's dialectic is in large part a spiritual dialectic, and a dialectic of ideas. Marx's is a materialist dialectic. That's what he calls it, a materialist dialectic. And Marx says, so history is not driven by ideas, rather ideas are driven by material developments. And it's really the thesis, antithesis, synthesis that's going on is a process of class conflict, right? Material class conflict. That's how it really works, right? So, in the relation of this to the religious question is that Hegel's ideas clearly has religious quality to it, right? Kind of element of mysticism, which Hegel doesn't deny, but Marx finds, ludicrous in his view. So then, politically, the implication is that we need to overcome the false consciousness of religion. We need to overcome false consciousness in general about how the world works and the structure of society and and so forth. But that all starts. I mean, the foundational part of the false consciousness is religious ideas, and so our our ideas that there is a God and that life should be um, organized according to that kind of belief. We've got to realize that's all false consciousness, and we need to come to a true consciousness, recognizing the way things really work in these materialist terms. And then, crucially, we ultimately need to develop a class consciousness, an awareness that we are part of a class, and that class dynamics are really driving things, right? And this was key to the revolution of the proletariat, right? Before they could successfully um, change their situation, they had to realize not just that their boss was oppressive and that the conditions of the factory were bad and so forth. They had to realize that their situation as factory workers, as a proletarian, um, was the situation of workers everywhere, all over the world. Right, there was a class which can be labeled the proletariat, which was um, much larger than the situation of my own factory, my own job situation, and realizing that I'm part of this class, and realizing everything that entails was critical to uh, paving the way for revolution. Right. This class consciousness enabled a solidarity with workers all over the world. Right. That was a big term that was developed, that was used often by socialists. Solidarity. Right. And now having class consciousness and the solidarity, uh, we could engage in collective action. Not just collective action in terms of getting a few people together to protest, what's happening at your factory, but establishing collective action in terms of a worldwide movement, a national and a worldwide movement. Right. All this depended upon class consciousness. Remember, the Communist Manifesto ends, "Workers of the world unite." This is what it required. How do we evaluate all this? The Marx's ideas on religion. Well, the way I'm going to do it is simply point out the vulnerability of his position philosophically. And the core of it is that he refuses to ask the fundamental question. Right. In his economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, an early work of Marx's, he's presenting this idea that man is a ground of his own being, that he is a self-creator, right? And developing that in terms of, man is fundamentally a producer, right? A creator in terms that he produces material things, and he finds his identity in that. The products of his labor are an expression of who he is, and by creating new things, he therefore becomes a different kind of person, right? He creates his own life through his production, right? But in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, he notes that there is a fundamental objection to this approach, that it seems um, it seems to fly in the face of human experience to say that human beings are really self-created, right? I mean, first of all, human beings didn't create their own existence. I mean, we didn't literally bring ourselves into existence. Right. And Marx acknowledges that, yeah, fine. But he says it's not relevant. And what he specifically takes up is the old theological um, argument for the existence of God, that there must be a first cause, right? So Aquinas develops this, which was an idea of Aristotle's, which is you're saying, you're asking, well, why are things the way they are? Well, they're caused by various things. You talk about natural causes and efficient causes, to use Aristotle's terms. That's the immediate causes, and so you can explain various natural phenomena by other natural phenomena. But if you push back the train of causes far enough, you come to a question of, well, what started it all? What was the first cause that caused all the other things to happen? And when you take that question seriously, you come back to, well, Aquinas said, you arrive at the question of God, right? What else could have started off existence than a self-existing being? And that kind of being, Aquinas says, is what we call God. And then, but then he and other Christian thinkers went beyond that to say that our existence, in terms of our real vitality, our real humanness, is rooted uh, in God's presence, right? His existence among us. And if we will come to terms with that, and if we will deepen that connection with God, then that's the way we will reach human fulfillment, right? Marx acknowledges that this is a fundamental objection. And his response is, that's a stupid question. In other words, he doesn't take the question seriously. He doesn't ask the question to consider whether, in fact, there might be something to it. Whether, in fact, the question must be asked to truly be philosophical about what you're doing here. And Marx's response is, it's a stupid question. The fundamental questions of human existence were expressed by a philosopher named Schelling in this way. Two questions. First, why is there something rather than nothing? That's the most fundamental question. And then secondly, why is the something what it is and not something else? I mean, so for example, on that second question, okay, so we can say how natural phenomena work, that this thing is preceded by this thing, and therefore that this preceding thing caused this thing. But do we know why causation works the way it does? Do we know why this thing should be connected in a causal way with this thing? Or why it works the way it does? And David Hume, what a great Enlightenment era philosopher, said, we have no idea. And philosophically, this is generally been accepted that we can't know the nature of causation. We can't know why it works the way it does. And that, again, leads to the question of divine creativity. So anyway, Marx just tables the question. Not just tables it, says, I'm leaving it behind, right? And this is a standard move of contemporary philosophers who are atheists. Smart people just can't believe that kind of stuff, right? But is this philosophical? To refuse to ask a question, and in particular, to refuse to ask the most fundamental questions, can that be considered philosophical? Or is it in fact anti-philosophical? And what would the consequences be of taking that question seriously? Well, in terms of Marx's theory, you can put the question in terms of premises and conclusions, right, on a basic level. So Marx's fundamental premise is materialism and the falseness of religion, or the non-existence of God, right? But you can say that if that premise is false, then his theory is false, right? His conclusions would be false if his premise is false. We've talked about in class the problem, elementary point of philosophy, that an argument can be valid but false, right? That is, it can hold together logically. One point in the in the train of logic can follow validly from another. But if the premise is false, then the argument is false, right? And so in Marx's terms, if his premise about the material process of things, if that's false, then his whole system, the theory of how things work, the relation of ideas to reality, the real sources and structure of society, and history, it all falls apart. Now, what if Marx had taken this question seriously? Even if, regardless of what the answer to that premise is, it would have immensely slowed him down. To ask the question seriously would be to put his program on hold. And as Marx said in the theses on Feuerbach, philosophers have tried in various ways to understand the world, but the point is to change it. So Marx's program would have been put indefinitely on hold, because the truth of his program would have been profoundly in question. Marx is an impatient man. He had things to do. He had a world to transform. Right. Don't have time for that. Okay, that's it for Marx on religion. I'll see you next time.